You're on.
This is the start of episode 2 of the Shaw family history. We started off episode 1 was all about leading up to the meeting and eventual marriage of Jimmy and Hilda Shaw, and the basic start of the family with daughter Jessie being born. And the marriage, as you recall, was in 1935, and Jessie was born in 1937. And by the start of World War II, which we're going to talk about with this episode, Jessie was just 2 going on 3, very close to 3 years old at that time. And the marriage had been 5 years into the marriage. So that's kind of where we're starting with this episode. And we're going to talk about what happened during World War II with the family. And just as background to the war itself, the actual war began in September of 1939 when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. They'd already occupied Czechoslovakia and Austria, but they had just kind of moved in and taken over. There wasn't any real fighting going on. But yeah, so the actual war started when they attacked Poland, and that attack began on September 1st of 1939. Britain and France as well both had mutual defense treaties with Poland. So if they're going to honor those treaties, they have to try to go rescue Poland. So on 3 days later, on September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Nazi Germany. Britain began mobilizing its army. On that same day they declared war, they passed the National Services Act, which required that all men, able men, between the ages of 18 and 41 were going to be drafted into the military. In Britain, that means either the Army, the Navy, or their Royal Air Force. And so there was going to be a draft. And that age bracket, 18 to 41, is kind of interesting because Jimmy Shaw was 32 at that time, right in the middle of it. If you read the actual act that they passed, it mentioned exclusions for being drafted. And it was, as you might expect, if you had a critical job that would be critical to the war effort, you were excluded, but you had to continue to work at your civilian job in the war. And my dad was a bus driver, so I'm not sure if that would be considered a critical job for the war effort. He was a bus driver, but he was also starting to show signs of rheumatoid arthritis, and there was an exclusion for medical purposes. So I'm not sure which one of those applied, and I'll speak to that a little bit later about the bus driver and the possibility that it could be a critical job to have. So anyway, Britain mobilized, sent troops and equipment over to Europe. It only took 3 weeks for Nazi Germany to conquer Poland. Then they turned back to the west and began marching through Belgium and Luxembourg and the Netherlands and Denmark, and started capturing all those areas. And that went fairly quickly. And the British troops, this was their first real combat. Not so for the Germans. They gradually got pushed back to the North Sea, and they landed there at the North Sea in the town of Dunkirk, which is in northern France, and that's where the evacuation started, trying to save the army and get it back to Britain across the North Sea and English Channel. The evacuation actually spanned from May 26th to June 4th of 1940. And so during that 10-day window there, they rescued all the troops they could. They left all the equipment behind. All their military equipment was basically lost, and they safely got back to Britain. But if you look at a map of at this time frame in World War II, uh, Nazi Germany, once France surrendered, and France surrendered in the middle of June there. Once they surrendered, just about all of Western Europe was under Nazi control. The only place that wasn't was Spain, and that was Franco and his dictatorship, and he got along just fine with the Nazis. So that wasn't. They were never attacked, and nobody expected them to be attacked. But Britain said, "Well, guess who's next? We're next," and they started preparing for a German invasion. With the troops they rescued, with the troops that were still going through their initial military training, uh, they began to come up with a defense scheme, which was basically trying to figure out and adjust where will Germany invade, where will they come across the channel to invade Britain, and then how does Britain set up defensive positions to try to fend off the invasion, and how do you mobilize troops to the invasion site once it starts? And so that was their strategy or strategic thinking at that time, to how to deal with the threatened invasion. Well, the Shaw family, they started preparing for the invasion too, as I'm sure all the families in Britain did, because they all saw it coming. And the basic plan was that Jimmy will stay in Scotland and defend the house, which at this time was they'd moved to 12 Gibbs Street from their original home, and that's the house I was eventually born in. That he would stay there in Britain and try to defend and take care of their house, and Hilda and baby Jesse, now 3 years old, would sail to America, go to Chicago, and move in with Hilda's parents, who had immigrated there in episode 1. We talked about that at that time. And so that was their plan. And in September of 1940, Hilda and little Jesse got on board a ship and ventured out across the North Atlantic to get to the United States and then on to Chicago. It was kind of interesting. On September 3rd of 1940, the first U-boat sinking of a surface ship had occurred. And so I'm sure they knew by the time they left that the U-boats were already out attacking ships sailing across the Atlantic Ocean. So that had to be in the back of their minds at the time for sure. So the Battle of Britain began, and it was basically two major efforts while preparing for the invasion. They started bombing Britain, and they started trying to head off commercial ships and British Royal Navy ships in the Atlantic. The idea being to actually put a blockade around the British Isles, so that shipping couldn't get in and out. And the interesting thing about this, though, and it really came into play, and I think it became evident fairly quickly, is that the German Army or Navy, they never had much of a Navy, but their Air Force was, the Luftwaffe was very powerful. But that doesn't help you invade somebody across open water. And Germany had no experience with that. And that actually was just a stroke of luck. The Brits weren't even thinking that way at the time, that they didn't know how to do a sea-based invasion. But it worked out to their benefit. So the bombing started. The bombing was primarily over London, but there were also other strategic sites that they bombed, and that included the two main ports in Great Britain that would receive shipping from the West, i.e., the United States or Canada. And so that was Liverpool and Glasgow, Scotland. So they became targets of the bombing. So that was the main thrust, plus the blockade around, and that was the start of the Battle of Britain. Britain, in preparing its defensive strategy, wanted, of course, they're thinking about, let's guard against the invasion. They also established what was called the Home Guard, and they had done this before. I think they did it in World War I as well, for the men that were not able to work because of medical conditions. They couldn't be in the military, or they had a critical job. They were drafted into the Home Guard, which were male citizens, and they were slowly equipped with military equipment. It didn't happen very fast, but their job was to help defend anything that might come up that the soldiers in the army couldn't deal with. Typically, and I didn't really get into studying this or get any numbers on it, but the types of things they got involved in were shot down planes. If there was a German bomber got shot down, they'd rally around to that location and see if they could catch survivors that they could imprison and try to get information from, or also maybe military secrets in those planes that are crashing. That was part of what they did. There was a famous spy case where they tried to parachute a German spy into Britain, and that was the Home Guard caught that man. So they were doing that kind of stuff. And and speaking about the Home Guard and the things they did, the Home Guard was organized, and in Lanarkshire, Scotland, 6 bus battalions were formed. And Lanarkshire is the county, or Shire County, is where Glasgow is. And of course, Glasgow is a huge shipbuilding area, steel production to make ships with, makes sense. So it was a big area, and they formed 6 bus battalions. Well, my dad drove a bus out of Airdrie, and his route was basically around the southern edge of Glasgow proper. And he'd go all the way over to the Irish Sea and turn around and come back again to Airdrie. And he'd go back and forth on that all the time. Well, one of the challenges of British strategy in home defense was, how do we get our soldiers that are spread out all along the coast from the northern tip of Scotland all the way down to the bottom of the English Channel, how do we get them quickly to the invasion site once we know where the invasion site is? And I've never heard it said or read, but the purpose of those 6 battalions was probably a fast way, or the fastest way they had, of getting the soldiers to the invasion site. And so if that was the strategy, if that's what those 6 bus battalions, and if they're organized into battalions, that's military. They're doing something military, and it had to be that. And because my dad was a bus driver, it's possible that he was excluded from the draft because of that, because they needed the bus drivers to transport troops as fast as possible when necessary. And the bombers, they really had a short flight across the English Channel, because they controlled France now. They take off from France, fly across, drop their bombs, fly back. And so also part of the British defense was the Royal Air Force, and the Royal Air Force was probably the best prepared for the start of the war. That was all Churchill's doing when he became prime minister. He emphasized the production of of the fighter planes they had, and getting them trained up to do that. And what they were doing was they were flying across the channel the other way. Bombers going one way, they're going the other. They'd intercept the bombers where they could, but they would also spy on, look at, shoot at German enforcements along the coast of France. And they also started observing the movement of barges. The German, just verifying that, hey, there's going to be a seaborne invasion, and these barges are forming along the French coast. So that's them getting organized, and let's disrupt that organization any way we can. And so that was the Royal Air Force's part of this thing. The blockade was primarily with U-boats, and they had surface raiders. The Germans would take a merchant ship and make it look like it's doing merchant stuff, and have a bunch of guns mounted on it, and that was a surface raider. They also had some ships they built before the war even started, pocket battleships, which became famous, and of course the Bismarck, and the Bismarck actually had a sister ship, which were huge, fast battleships, and so that was also part of that blockade effort that went on. So the bombing continued, the blockade around the islands continued, and there was a problem in Germany's eyes. We've got all these soldiers ready to invade Britain, but we've got no way of getting them across the English Channel. So what are we going to do with all these soldiers? They're just sitting around being worthless. And they said, well, I got a good idea. Hitler always had a good idea. He said, let's invade Russia. So he took all those troops and moved them to the Eastern Front and planned an invasion of Russia. Once that invasion started, all of a sudden, hey, there's no way they can invade Britain now, because all their fighting soldiers, ground soldiers, have gone to fight Russia. And so instead of being a 3-month conquering of Moscow, which Hitler envisioned, it became a very long, drawn-out battle on the Eastern Front. And what Hitler decided was just to continue what they were doing, continue bombing, although at reduced levels because they needed their Air Force support to take Russia. But continue the U-boats, continue some bombing to a lesser extent, and making it, of course, harder to starve out Britain, which was the whole idea of the blockade. As this became evident there wasn't going to be an invasion, then Hilda and little Jessie, and I'm assuming my dad had to have known about this with mail going back and forth, and then Hilda's parents, but Hilda and Jessie decided they were going to sail back to Scotland and reunite the family, since there's no longer a threat of an invasion. Whether they knew it or not, they decided to do this at the very height of U-boat successes in the North Atlantic. There must have been newspaper articles and that kind of thing they could read where the U-boat sank this boat, the U-boat sank that boat. But I actually saw a stat that in the first 20 days of March 1943, the U-boats sank 93 ships. That's a lot of ships going down, but that was their purpose, and they were merchant ships. Regardless of what they knew or what they didn't know, they booked passage to return to Scotland, departing on February 28, 1943. So in other words, right at the very start of this massive success of U-boat sinkings of merchant ships, they're going to sail into that. And I don't know if they knew how much danger was involved with that or not, or maybe it didn't matter to them. I just don't know what they knew and what they didn't know. So they booked this passage. They booked it on, it was actually a New Zealand ship, the SS Akaroa, that they were sailing on, and so they boarded on the 28th of February and getting ready to sail across the North Atlantic. The ship actually it had 200 passenger cabins on it, and it had 422,000 cubic feet of refrigerated storage. So it was in a truck they call it a reefer. I don't know if they call it a reefer in a ship or not, but it was a refrigerator ship. And this thing was full of lamb, frozen lamb meat that and mutton, frozen mutton that was being sent from New Zealand to Britain to help feed the people. Britain never could feed itself. It didn't have enough arable land to do that with. And so, but it had the 200 passenger cabins, so it stopped in New York and then picked up passengers and getting ready to cross the Atlantic. Hilda and Jesse actually were assigned roommates on the Akaroa. Jean and Frankie Waters. Jean was an American wife of a British soldier, and Frankie was her 7-year-old son, and they were sailing to be where Jean's husband was over in Britain. So there's 4 sharing this cabin, and they actually became lifelong friends. In fact, it was even to the point that when I was stationed in Colorado in the Army, I drove up to Boulder where Frankie was living at that time and spent a weekend with him. So it even spilled over to the next generation. So as I said, this was right at the peak of the U-boat successes. And so they sailed on. And the typical way to sail from New York to Britain was you sail up along the coast to that was my arm creaking there. But anyway, you sail up along the coast, and when you I guess you hit Labrador or you run out of land, then you cut across to Britain from there, and so that's the way the thing started. Now, one of the things, and I think it was known by everybody pretty much, is that Germany had spies in New York City, and they could communicate to Germany whenever they saw another convoy forming to cross the North Atlantic. So typically, the Germans knew of every convoy that was crossing the Atlantic and could relay that information to their submarines and position their submarines accordingly. And this is part of the reason they were able to sink so many in that period. So that's that was going on with all the convoys. I guess a little side thing from that. To some extent, the Brits, and I'll say the Allies, because America had a slight involvement. They had cracked the German codes that were being used, and they actually cracked the Luftwaffe code first. However, the Navy code was about 6 times more complicated than the Luftwaffe, but they were starting to crack the Navy codes also with the Enigma machine. The Enigma machine was an encoding and receiving machine that the Germans were using, and the way it worked is every time you hit a key, the codes would change. They'd reset themselves and reset themselves. So like if you're sitting there at your Enigma machine sending a message, and you hit the letter A 3 times, it would print out on the other end 3 different letters. It wouldn't all be the same letter each time. It would actually be 3 different, because the code kept changing as they used it. Eventually, the Brits cracked it, and they later on invented a machine that would do it, probably the world's first computer of any magnitude. So they could actually, in fairly quick order, crack these messages that the Germans were sending. But that wasn't happening to any great extent when Hilda and Jesse sailed, but it was to some extent. So anyway, they start on their way, and as they're going by Halifax, they decided that the convoy was too big, and I'm going to give you the convoys. They were all numbered, and this particular convoy was HX228, HX being short for Halifax, and then 228. So that was the number that was assigned. The HX also meant it was a fast convoy. They had 2 categories. They had SC convoys, which were slow convoys, and then they had the HX, which were the faster boats. Because a convoy can only go as fast as its slowest boat. Otherwise, it would break up. So when they get to near Halifax, going past Halifax, 15 ships from HX228 were pulled out of the convoy and sent to Halifax. And the basic thinking of this was that the convoy was too large to safely cross the Atlantic. That the larger a convoy, the more space in the ocean it takes up, and the easier it is to spot by the Germans. So they shrink that footprint by removing ships. And so 15 ships, including the Akaroa, were pulled out of the convoy and sent to Halifax to wait for the next convoy. It always intrigued me why pick the fastest ship in the convoy, which was the Akaroa, and that's a fact. I didn't just make that up. It was the fastest, and send it to Halifax. If I were the head of the convoy, I would send the 15 slowest ships, because then the whole convoy could move faster. But that isn't what happened. For some reason, the Akaroa was sent to Halifax, even though it was the fastest ship in the convoy. That was 15 ships, and they actually hit Halifax on March 6th. So they left New York on February 28th. It's now March 6th. They pull out of the convoy on the 6th and go to Halifax. 15 ships. They're waiting the next convoy. Well, the next convoy turned out to be HX229. Gee, that's interesting. In numerical order. Anyway, that was facetious for you that don't understand jokes. Okay. So now we get to 5 days later. They're in Halifax 5 days. They set sail to join up with HX229, which was also seen by spies in New York, leaving the harbor. And so the Germans knew that one was coming, HX229, and they joined up with them on March 11th. And when they joined up with HX229, they decided now it's too big to send across the ocean. It'd be too easy to spot. So what they did was they split it in half. They split it into 2 separate convoys and gave them 2 separate routes across the Atlantic, trying to reduce the ability of the Germans to see them. And if they decided to try to cover all those lanes, of course there'd be fewer and fewer U-boats in the wolf packs that were doing all the attacking. So it was split. HX229, the original, and the split off group was called HX229A, and it was assigned a more northerly route than HX229's original route. And so at that point they split, and they both start heading to Britain. And if you ever wonder if there's really a God and how God's hands might get into it, I've got a little thing, all the dates and everything, and it gets a little all run together. And I'm going to put this up there, and it's a little graphic I made. Of a timeline of the three convoys we're talking about. If you look at the top line up there, you see HX228 departing New York City on February 28th, and then 15 ships pulled off on March 6th and went to Halifax. Well, 4 days later, the HX228 convoy was attacked. That was on March 10th. 5 ships were sunk out of the convoy, and the rest of them journeyed on. They didn't all make it. There was, ships break down just like cars do, and some of them had to pull out to go to Iceland for repairs. Some of them actually had to turn and go back. There's some different things. So I didn't make a record here of how many ships actually made it all the way across. But anyway, you see on that second line across there, the Akaroa is in Halifax for those 5 days, and then it departs on the 11th and joins up with HX229 on the 14th of March, and then they decided at that point they had to split the convoy in half, so they formed HX229A, and Akaroa was assigned to that ship. Well, the HX229 sailed on. 2 days later, started the largest U-boat convoy battle in the entire war. And you can see by the dates down here, it lasted 3 to 4 days. One of the things that made it larger was that HX229 actually caught up with a slow convoy that had left before them. And so in fact, the Germans spotted the slow convoy first, and they thought it was HX229. So anyway, all of a sudden, they've got 2 convoys for targets. And so that battle went on from March 16th to March 19th. Out of HX229, 13 ships were sunk. I do not know how many were sunk. I can look it up, but I haven't. Of the slow convoy that were actually sunk. But this had to be like a turkey shoot for the U-boats. It was just amazing. And then here on the bottom line, here's HX229A formed when it split off from HX229. And here's the one ship one convoy that the German spies couldn't tell Germany it was coming because they didn't know it existed. It didn't exist until they were all out in the middle of the ocean. And then you look at my little explosion signs there. Who got hit, who got attacked? The known convoys were hit and attacked. The unknown convoy, the biggest problem it has was dodging icebergs on the northern route they sent it on. And it sailed across without encountering a single U-boat from there. So that's I got to thinking, the Lord was with the Akaroa. It got across there, and for whatever reason, it defied all odds and got across without a single U-boat seeing it. So it was that just struck me later as an amazing thing, especially when it impacts your own family. So they sailed on across, and they actually landed in. They couldn't get into Glasgow or Liverpool because those ports, the two main ones, were all backed up with ships waiting for dock space to go in and unload. And so instead of, they were supposed to go, they were scheduled to originally go to Liverpool. They ended up instead going to Cardiff, Wales, and that's where they landed there on March 27th. About March 27th, they left on February 28th. So one day short of 4 weeks it took to get across. The other thing I got to thinking about in all this, they're out in the middle of the Atlantic. The wolf boat packs are having the biggest the biggest success of the whole war. 90 some ships sunk, and Hilda's parents back in Chicago, and Jimmy in Scotland. You're assuming they're hearing the news, reading the newspapers, whatever, and they hear about all these attacks and all these ships being sunk, and yet they're not hearing anything from anybody because the ships couldn't even radio messages back and forth among themselves, much less send information back to America or forward to Britain. The total information blackout, and they're thinking 3 weeks and we haven't heard anything, 4 weeks and we haven't heard anything, except that lots of ships are being sunk. So there must have been a lot of hand-wringing going on by the families on both sides of the Atlantic during that period. One of the things I did look up is I looked up the manifests of the Akaroa when it docked in Cardiff, Wales, and I got a list of all the people that were on it, and I found my mother's name, and my sister Jessie's name, and there was Gene Waters' name and Frankie Waters' name, and then all the other people that were passengers on that ship. And of course, the background, the history of them all, their names, where they're from, where they going, why are they on there, that kind of stuff. But there was a separate manifest that I found later from the Akaroa on that sailing, and it was British soldiers, and I'd say there were about 100 of them on that list. So, and I don't know this. Maybe if I scratched a little deeper, probably wouldn't take much scratching to find out if they were Royal Air Force or if they were Army or what they were. But they got off that ship, and Cardiff also, and it made me realize that probably, I don't know it, assuming, probably the reason that the Akaroa was pulled out of the convoy it was in and sent to Halifax was to pick up these British soldiers and bring them back to Britain. And my thinking was they were probably training. Oh, I'm sorry, Britt. Excuse me, I just kicked my dog. Anyway, but they were probably over training Canadians to help prepare them to get into the war. So if they're over there training Canadians and the use of the equipment, especially fighter planes, here's how you fly our fighter planes. And those Spitfires, they were a very well known and very effective weapon of war during World War II. The Spitfires, training them and using that, and so and it could be that the regular passengers didn't even know that all these soldiers had come on board. And you know, if you think about it, you wouldn't want them to know. You wouldn't want the word getting out that that ship's full of soldiers, so it's twice as good a target to go get. And with 200 cabins, I mentioned that earlier, on that ship, they could probably reserve a deck, you know, solely for those soldiers to keep them totally away from the civilian passengers that would be on a separate deck. It'd be easy enough to do. And so that's possibly why the fastest ship in the convoy was pulled out and sent to Halifax. Not because it was the fastest ship or anything like that, but because it had 200 cabins on it, and it had space to take all of those soldiers that were on the manifest. So the so the family gets reunited in March, and happy celebration. My my sister, I'm talking to my sister about some of the stuff and what she remembers, because now at this stage she's 5 years old, where she had just turned 3 when they left, and they get off, and she couldn't understand why her mother and this man were hugging and kissing when they got. She said she remembered it, but she was confused. She didn't know what was going on. What's all this about? So anyway, but they got reunited, and then the war ended in I was born in February 45, very near the end of the war in Europe, and then the war in Europe actually ended in May of 1945. I remember, kind of as a postscript, asking my dad once about what he did during the war, knowing that as a little guy, when I asked a question, I asked him, I said, "Were you in the service?" And he said, "Yes, I was in the civil service. I drove a bus." And so I thought that was kind of funny. But he told me about the times that first of all that Britain can't feed itself, so they encouraged everybody to grow as much food as they can, and plus everything was rationed. They're just trying to have enough food to go around for everybody. And so what he did was he took that little plot of ground around 12 Gibbs Street, and I think I showed this last time, but here it is again. And that lower left-hand unit, it was a quadplex with 4 apartments in it. But if you look, that one on the lower left is 12 Gibbs Street. That's where my dad was. Well, he plowed up the front yard there and planted potatoes. So he was potato farming there. And if you look at a satellite shot of this on Google Earth or something, you see the backyard is quite large. And in fact, if you see that tree line off in the distance behind the building, it went all the way back to that tree line. So he also raised chickens, and so there'd be chicken coops. And I don't know what was in the front yard or what was in the backyard, but I think that front yard either had potatoes or chickens, and the backyard probably had more potatoes and more chickens. But anyway, that's what he was doing. And one of the things he told me was that the chicken feed was rationed along with everything else, and he had a ration card for chicken feed, but you don't get enough chicken feed to feed all those chickens that he had. Well, he was getting eggs. He wasn't raising chickens to eat. He was raising eggs, and he'd get eggs on his bus doing his bus route, and they would clandestinely swap eggs for more ration cards. But they had this underground economy going, and ration cards and eggs, and so he could have more chickens, feed more chickens, and then also that the chickens, I don't know if they learned to or they were just hungry enough, they were fed potato peels. So my dad had saved the potato peelings and feed them to the chickens. And I remember one of the things my mother told me is that those eggs had the hardest shells of any egg she'd ever tasted or cooked. And so that's a lesson to you all. If you want to get really hard, if you break a lot of eggs and you want harder shells, feed them potato skins. That's sure to work. Anyway, that's the end of the episode 2. Episode 3, I'll start pulling that together. That's going to be the immigration from Britain to America. So thank you very much. Enjoy.